Thank you very much for inviting me to your first forum on leadership and education, and in particular I'd like to thank William Roberts for his leadership in organizing all of this. I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership of Ruth Richardson and the Metcalf Foundation and Catherine Townsend from the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network for their Thought Leaders Paper series and for inviting me to write a paper, which I believe is the reason why I've been invited here today to share some of my work with you. I believe that what you're doing today is very, very critical to provide space for new initiatives, and I see this meeting as very important for the sustainability of the sea to sky corridor. I am sorry that I cannot be here in person, but I hope this is only the beginning of many, many conversations that we can have. I'd like to start by sharing with you what I mean by sustainable community, by some of the research projects that I'm working on. I work on projects involving social capital. I'm very privileged to hold a Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Community Development. I have an e-research agenda. I work in both place and virtual communities because I truly believe that through the internet we can speed the exploitation of knowledge between communities so that not every kid in Tuktoyaktuk has to move to Vancouver in order to have access to the expertise there. I'm also researching with a very, very good, strong research team into sustainable infrastructure. And I also have a research project that is exploring the relationships between agency, social capital, and sustainable community development. And by agency, I mean individual agency, the ability to transcend a personal tragedy, or in terms of a community agency, the ability to transcend an economic collapse. I'd like to just first briefly share with you my understanding of sustainable development, and it's a definition that John Robinson and colleagues worked on at the University of British Columbia in the 1990s. It can be seen as a process of reconciliation through the ecological imperative to live with the global biophysical carrying capacity and maintain biodiversity, the social imperative as defined there, and the economic imperative to ensure that basic needs are met worldwide, and equitable access to resources, ecological, social, and economic, is fundamental to its implementation. There are fundamental barriers to achieving sustainable development, and they are not primarily technical or economic or even scientific, but they're institutional, the codes, standards, norms, reward systems, and incentives that are in our way. Although it would help to get the prices right, still fundamentally constrained, independent of intent, if the norms and rules of the games are not mutually reinforcing and remain often conflicting. So I think what that means for the environmental movement, and in particular environmental education, we have to broaden our scope to include areas like land use, transportation infrastructure, urban form, lifestyle, and consumption. It's not about convincing people that it is important any longer, I believe, because I think climate change is getting us all there much more quickly. Changing the rules of the game is. Individual behavior is not the problem. We won't get close. We need big collective decisions on infrastructure, land use patterns, and built environments. It's essentially about mobilizing people for policy changes that are necessary. We have to rethink about how we engage people and the collective decisions that are necessary for social change. At the same time, we have to address institutional barriers by focusing on the rules of the game that prevent us from acting, mobilize public support, create partnerships with the research and private sectors for greater knowledge confusion. It's a big dream, but is it doable? I believe so. So I hope I've convinced you that sustainable development is the human imperative of the 21st century. And it involves the reconciliation of what it is important to us to sustain in the places we live, our communities, with the scale of our activities, recognizing that there are limits to development in order to sustain diversity. I think we're now at a stage in human evolution where our scale of activities is so large that we are affecting natural systems which used to evolve independently of us, that we are now co-evolving one with the other. Many communities in this country are facing problems of overdevelopment, others underdevelopment, and in many communities redevelopment, and how to reconcile. This all affects the sustainable development of the corridor, sea to sky. And the question I want you to ask yourselves, is it sustainability for some or for all? So how do we make a difference? Enough of the academic stuff. I don't want to bore you overly. Let's get into the purpose of our meeting today. As I understand it from the organizers, all of you have a profound love for your communities. How can you engage your passion in making a difference now? I believe that there are three three key elements to making a difference: critical mass, connectivity, and modern communications. In terms of critical mass, we're not going to move anywhere unless we have a shared vision. It makes governments powerless to act, and it allows the traditional vested interests to continue to dominate, and we all avoid change. For example, a lack of shared vision is manifested in how full or how empty a world we think we live in. We have no shared meaning on the scale of the problem and its urgency. There's a conflict between people who think we still live in an empty world, a problem of the developing world, or do we live in a nearly full world, and that determines the agency scale and limits. And some of us believe that we have already exceeded critical thresholds. Obviously, policies designed for a nearly full world will differ dramatically from the other two scenarios: an empty world, or a getting full world, or a nearly full world, and the emphasis that people place on the urgency of acting now. This latter scenario of a nearly full world means that we will need to examine the scale of our activities and start to question, are there actually finite limits to our development? So the first step in developing a shared vision, at least in one region, never mind the environmental movement as a whole. We also have to allow for self-organizing phenomena. Even if there is a consensus on a common vision, people need to feel they can influence and make a difference, or they will disengage. We have to allow for many different pathways to achieve the vision. We have to build a cohesive constituency around the change we wish to see. For example, when I was doing my doctoral work, Jim McNeil, who was the author of the Brundtland Commission, criticized my work because he said, "Anne, we have not achieved a common constituency for sustainable development, and you should address that." For example, climate change is good for the GDP. As more people buy air conditioners, our economy goes up. Divorce is good for the economy. People have to buy other homes and spend money on lawyers. So we really have to look at decide what the key themes are and where we're going to work. We have to identify the strategic alliances we need to build to implement those changes. Alliances are relationships or networks between people working in government, the private sector, and civil society, which I'll also refer to later as vertical social capital. You need to identify the people you need around the table to implement the changes you wish to see, build strategic partnerships. But we also need deliberate design for those partnerships. You have to not necessarily assume you'll get the right people around the table, but you have to identify what are your gaps, what decision makers you need around the table to be able to make the changes that you wish to see in the corridor. But you cannot have too much diversity or the group will break apart.